Today we start with some general writing tips, how to write an academic thesis, and of course these tips are also useful, I hope, when writing other stuff than the master thesis.
I believe that writing an introduction is the most difficult part of writing, well, not only an academic essay, but any text. So I'll make a clip next, practical, about writing an introduction. Almost as hard is writing an end to an essay, a thesis. So I will give you some tips on how to do that. I'll make this clip for practical number 4. So today we will not focus on these issues. So we'll not focus on the introduction and the conclusion. First of all, I have to mention plagiarism. I take it you all know what plagiarism is and that you shouldn't plagiarize, but still it happens. It almost happens every year that there is, even in a small group like the group of students at the philosophy department, usually there's someone who plagiarizes. Just don't do it. You're a philosopher, think for yourself, write for yourself. That's the fun of it. Plagiarism. Why should you plagiarize to get to write a philosophical thesis? I don't get it. Writing a thesis, even though we have a lot of rules and regulations to make sure that you do it, that every student has the same amount of supervision, etc. It should be fun. It should be an effort, yes, but it should be fun to write your own thesis. There is just no excuse for plagiarism. If you get ill, well, obviously that's not nice, but it's not an excuse for plagiarism. Just postpone writing your thesis. We will try to make it work for you. Maybe you need to change the topic if it is somewhere along the line it turns out what you're writing about is not your cup of tea. But never just finish it and by using work of other people and presenting it as your own work, because that's basically what plagiarism is. So sometimes it's just better to postpone something or to start over again. That's better than have a record that says that you have plagiarized. And of course, if you could be expelled from the university even. Sometimes students think they can bypass plagiarism by plagiarizing and substituting words with synonyms. So what I sometimes see that happens, not every year, but usually every 2 or 3 years, something like that, there is a student who basically has found a text, copies paragraph 1, put the entire paragraph in quotation marks. So that's not plagiarism, it's just a really long quote. Then the next paragraph is not put into quotation mark, but it is copied and pasted into the thesis. And then some words are substituted for synonyms. And usually those are synonyms, because you just use the word app to find synonyms. And synonyms, well, there might be synonyms in some context, but not in the context you are substituting the word for, and then you get really awkward formulations. So the grammar is okay, but the formulation, the meaning is really different from the original meaning. And of course, substituting some words almost automatically, that is not writing your own text. That's just presenting work of others as your own. So don't do that. That will constitute plagiarism. Before you start writing, you obviously need to choose a topic, and I will help you with that if you have problems with that. So that's partially what this course is about. So you can think about, you can philosophize about almost anything, of course, but there are topics that are better suited for a thesis in philosophy than others. So I hope you have found a supervisor, or well, you have done some courses where the supervisor, where the lectures were inspiring and got you to think about different topics, or you have found a philosopher you find really interesting during the lectures, and that is the starting point of choosing a topic. If you have things in your own background that were not discussed during the courses and that are not listed as expertise, areas of expertise of our lecturers. So, for instance, if you're very religious, then you might want to write about a topic that's more a theological topic than a philosophical topic. And then, well, yeah, we don't have theologians in the department. So that means that if you want to write about that, you might not find a supervisor that feels comfortable supervising a thesis on that topic. And the same goes for if you're interested in sociological things, for instance, or that might still be the case, or economics or psychology. You could write on the philosophy of economics or sociology or psychology more easily than on the philosophy of physics, because at our university we don't have a physics department, and therefore we haven't hired philosophers that are specialized in philosophy of physics. But we do have sociology, we do have economics, we do have psychology, so you could do a thesis on philosophy of mind, for instance. But take a look at the topics mentioned in the overview of the research interests and of the different lecturers. And if the topic is not in there, it might be a problem finding a supervisor for the topic you want to write about. So don't make it difficult for yourself and find something that you find interesting that is actually part of well, the areas of expertise of the lectures we have in our department. First of all, it's a good thing to make an overview and make it big, in the sense that you don't write much detail on it, but take a A4 sheet of paper and a big marker and write down introduction, chapter 1, and then the topics of chapter 1, chapter 2, the topics of chapter 2, etc. So that it all fits on one sheet, and pin it to the wall and stick to it. Stick to that overview, and don't write too many details on it, so that you have a clear view of what you're going to do. Obviously, you can change things along the way. If you're doing research, then it turns out sometimes that you have to change your plan. Then make a new overview and discuss this, of course, with your supervisor if you want to do that, because that will take time. So stick to that overview. Don't say, now I've written the very first paragraphs of chapter 1, and I now think that I should have a chapter on this, and a chapter on that, and a chapter on that. Then you're writing a book, then you're writing a life achievement. A master thesis is just a big essay. It's not a lifetime achievement. So stick to the plan. You have the plan written down in your thesis registration form. Make an overview using that, and then stick to that. So make sure you have a clear idea of what you're going to do. Also, and stick to that as well, you can use this overview to say, okay, so I have, say, an introduction and a conclusion and 3 chapters. And the conclusion and the introduction together have just as many words as chapter 1 and as chapter 2 and as chapter 3. So you have to divide your time also in 4 time slots. If you have trouble sticking to deadlines, make sure you discuss this with your supervisor, because you could on the thesis registration form say when it's about a meeting, say, well, we have 4 meetings or 5 meetings or 7 meetings and that's it. And you can also say, well, I hand in chapter 1 on this date and we'll discuss that on that date, etc. So you have you have together made a series of deadlines for the different chapters you have to hand in. So make this time schedule, at least for yourself, and also stick to it. If you have problems sticking to that, make sure your supervisor knows and that you put this in the thesis registration form. Not all supervisors will make this for you, so you have to come up with it yourself. And of course, the supervisor must have time on the given dates or just after the given dates for providing feedback when you have handed in those, when you have scheduled to hand in those chapters. So make sure you do this, you make this schedule, and then you also see when you need to start. Take also into account that there is this go, no-go moment, which is very early in the next semester. So basically you have to hand in something prior to the next semester so that your supervisor has something to judge your work on, and hopefully can give you the go based on that. So that means you have to start on time, and this is a big problem for some students. Do not start on time. So if you make this time schedule, you see when you have to hand in your first chapter, and then you'll see, well, then you have to start writing a couple of weeks before that. It's fairly obvious, but just make such a time schedule if you have trouble sticking to deadlines. Right, so this is also about writing the preliminary thesis plan, but it also obviously applies to writing anything in general, so also to the writing of the master thesis. Many preliminary thesis plans contain unsupported or inaccurate opening statements. I will look at them, I will give you feedback on that, and hopefully then you can change that in to more accurate statements. So some students open with stuff like, it said that. Well, who did say it? Make sure you have an actual reference, and maybe not in a preliminary thesis plan, because you don't have that many words to put all the reference into it, but you can just say Plato said that, or Aristotle said that, things like that, instead of it said that or has been claimed that and giving no reference. So you must be accurate. So make sure that if you attack a claim, there is someone that actually makes the claim. Also, don't oversimplify claims. Sometimes students say things like X causes Y, and then there are many other variables that are relevant to Y than just X. And then they argue from that assumption and just look at X, for instance. And that obviously also will not be accurate if you basically ignore all the other elements that have an influence on Y. So make sure you are accurate there as well, that it's detailed enough. And if it becomes too detailed, well, so that you have to explain too much, so it becomes a book, well, then you need to change your topic. Also, there are many students that make a claim themselves that is not supported. So if the first bullet point here is that some people say that, blah, 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 you can also yourself make the claim, blah, blah, blah. Like society determines what we think, and just took something. Well, if you make that claim, again, you should use references to people actually making the claim. Otherwise, you're making a claim, and then if you say, well, but that's problematic and it's not true, then you're attacking a claim that nobody makes. So make sure that if you make a claim yourself, that it's also supported by, well, references to text in which the claim has been made. So make sure you are writing about something that is a real topic, basically. Another thing that you should take care of is that you keep it balanced. Obviously, and it's obvious, but sometimes goes wrong. That's why I put it in these general writing tips. The main body should contain the most words. So, for instance, if you have 4 chapters, an introduction and a conclusion, so you have, if the introduction and the conclusion together are just as much as one chapter, then you have, say, 5 parts that have an equal length in numbers of words. So you have, say, 15,000 words divided by 5 is you have 3,000 words for each chapter, and then you have 1,500 words for the introduction and 1,500 for the conclusion. What you could do is you have made this overview, which says introduction, chapter 1, chapter 2, etc. You've put a time frame next to it. You could also put the word count for each part next to it, and then stick to it. So you say, okay, so this means that chapter 1 has to have 3,000 words maximum. And if you then start writing and you notice that you write too much, so you could do that, right? You could say write 6,000 words, but then you have to kill your darlings and delete stuff you might find very interesting, but which is well, there's no room for it to put in your first chapter or in the thesis at all. Then, in the end, so then you could do that like this. You could start by making an overview, of course, for chapter 1, and try to put everything into the 3,000 words, and stick to that, and don't go over the word limit. You could also just write, and then you might end up with 5,000 words, say, and then you rewrite it so that it contains only 3,000 words. So you have to kill your darlings, and then you can do things. You can delete the least important parts, and if you do it like this will be time consuming, right? But then what you'll end up with is probably the better parts of these 5,000 words, because you delete some stuff. You say, well, this is not really on topic, or this is something that, well, I'm not sure about, and then you get a better piece, better chapter 1. And what you could do then as a second thing is write down the things you deleted, because those themes, those issues, could be put in the conclusion as suggestions for further research. And if someone, if the supervisor or the second reason then asks you about the further research in your defense, you already have some ideas of how to do that, how to answer such questions. So killing your darlings, it's not a nice thing to do, but it might, so you might try to avoid it by not writing more than the amount of words you have for a chapter. And if you do that, you kill your darlings, but you put them aside for a later date, and you write about that in a next piece, something you might try to publish, or indeed for next further research. But your thesis should be well balanced. So the introduction should not contain 6,000 words if you have 15,000 words, right? Another thing when writing, when it comes to balance, is quoting texts. Obviously, you're allowed to quote text. That's not plagiarism. Just make sure you refer. You don't present it as your own work. Just refer to the original author or authors. And make sure that, again, the text is balanced. If you copy a quote and it's half a page in your thesis, well, that's a really long quote. You might do this once, maybe twice, but usually quotes are shorter. And if you have your entire thesis containing of pages that have quotes that are this big on every page, then you have quoted half your thesis. That's not a thesis. That's basically a lot of quotes together. So you need to think about what the purpose of a quotation is. So it can be an explanation. Usually it's an illustration, or it's something that you say, well, this is an odd claim this author, this philosopher makes. I make sure that I quote the philosopher here, because if I don't, people might not believe that this person is actually claiming this. So it's a strategy I use in my lectures, for instance. If I lecture on Kuhn or Feierabend, when Feierabend is talking about voodoo, if I just say Feierabend is claiming this about voodoo, then you might say, well, Hans, I can't believe anyone is saying that. But if I put the quote on a PowerPoint slide with a reference, people can look it up, and indeed, he makes this really odd claim. So if someone makes a very strong or strange claim, use a quote to make sure that people don't think you made it up or you misinterpreted the philosopher. Usually, then, a quote is in need of explanation. Sometimes it's an illustration, and then, of course, you already explain the theory, and then you have an illustration. But usually, if you use a quote, then it's in need of explanation. So it's not an explanation itself. So you need to write about the quote. So you can't say in an argument there are 3 steps. Step 1, you explain. Step 2, you just give a quote, and then step 3, and you explain it again. Then you need to explain what the author is saying in step 2, in the step 2 of the argument. So otherwise, it's just saying, well, I'm not going to explain it and just copy paste it. You have to elaborate on the quote. Okay, so that's on quotation, of course, but the topic here basically is keep it balanced. Keep, if possible, your quotes brief. So don't cite half a page on every page on your in your thesis. Now, there is a small issue, but it is important for academic writing. So if you want to put emphasis on something, you never use bold. So I can do this in a PowerPoint slide with the word never, but you would not do that in an actual written text. That's a paper or an article or a master thesis. If you want to emphasize something, you put it in italics. That's the usual way. Now, if you want to emphasize something in a quotation that is not already emphasized, then you put it in italics. And then that's the third bullet point here. You add the italics, and so you have to put in the reference some notification that you're the one that put the italics in the quotation. So don't put every quote in italics. Sometimes you'll see that students put every quote in italics. So that's then basically their own rule. quotes should be put in italics. Maybe there are some high schools where they teach that, I don't know, it's wrong. Don't do that. Only use italics if the italics are part of the quote itself, for the original text. And it could, of course, be the case that you quote a sentence and that the sentence is already in italics in the original text. Well, then put it in italics. And if someone then says, why did you put this entire sentence, this entire quote in italics? Then you just say, well, look it up, it's in the original. If you add the italics in a part of the, or in the entire quote, but that would be a bit odd to do that. But if you would put emphasis on some words in the quote by using italics, just say italics mine or italics ours or something like that, depending on the type of reference style you use. Look that up. And also, never ever use underscore at all. Never. So not in a title, not on the title page, never. We've arrived in the 21st century. That means that we don't use underscore to emphasize anything at all. So that's basically something you use when writing a text with the use of a typewriter. Then you don't have italics, then you don't have bold, and then you could use caps or you could use underscore. We've arrived in the 21st century, so you don't use underscore. Obviously, if you quote a really old text and people have used underscore there, then you should use it, but never use it yourself to put in the text at your own, or if you want to add emphasis to a quote, use italics and not underscore. Of course, you could use, for going back to bold, you could use it for headings, right? Like emphasis in quotes and underscore, you could do that in a text as well. And you could use italics there, but not underscore. Another thing that is important is that because philosophy can be really difficult and you have to write about a difficult topic or a philosopher that is not all that clear in their writing, then you have to write about what the philosopher was saying, and well, if it's not all that clear, you might not really understand what you're writing about. So it could be the difficulty of the topic, it could also be the, say, awkward writing style of the philosopher you are reading. So make sure that you understand what you're writing. This could, of course, mean that you misinterpret the author, if the author themselves is really vague, but try not to copy the vagueness. So try to be as clear as possible, and that means that you should be able to explain it. So if you write something in your master thesis that's quite vague, then you might expect a question about that on your, well, when discussing, of course, a first draft of a chapter, but later also if it's still in the thesis, also on the defense, on your defense. So, and then you should be able to elaborate on it. So try to be as clear as possible, and one way to be as clear as possible is to make sure you understand what you're writing. So if you don't understand it, then you probably cannot explain it right, and your tutor, so the supervisor and the second reader, probably will notice that. And now you run the risk of doing the following. You copy the vague quote, you put it in quotation marks, and you refer to the original text, and if you then don't elaborate on it, it looks quite alright. But basically, now you have summarized the text, and you have taken a really difficult or vague part of the text, you put it without explanation in your thesis, And now your supervisor and the second reader don't really know whether you understood what that piece of text was about, because you didn't explain it. So never write things down you don't understand. It's better to make a mistake and be corrected by your supervisor, and then this mistake will not be in your final thesis. Then to put it in there, and your supervisor might think, well, this is okay, might not see that it should be explained, and then the second reader might say, well, but this is not explained. And then they have a disagreement, of course, but in that case, the second reader would be right, I think. So make sure you understand what you're writing. If you quote someone, make sure that you elaborate on the quote. This elaboration, this explanation of what you're writing about, or what a philosopher is saying, or philosophers are saying, is something you should keep in mind when writing. So you should explain basically everything. That is, you should explain all the philosophical issues, all the philosophical topics. So you don't write, obviously, for someone who is in kindergarten. You write for a student that has the same cognitive capacities, so you can still so you can use the language you would use to talk with your fellow students. But you're writing for someone that doesn't do philosophy, for instance. So write your thesis as if you're writing it for a liberal arts and sciences student or a psychology student, someone like that. And then ask yourself the question, would this person understand what I'm writing here? You're not writing for your tutors, because they probably know what you're writing about. So don't write, if you write a thesis on Kantian epistemology or something like that, don't say things like, think about or think of the distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal world in his work. Now explain that. Explain what a phenomenal world is, explain what the noumenal world is. You can do that briefly. You don't have to write an entire chapter on that if that's not your the topic. But if you mention this, make sure that you explain those terms, those concepts. You basically are writing for the uninformed reader. So the reader is uninformed on the topic you're writing about. Talk about this with your supervisor. So I'm giving you these general writing tips, and maybe my colleagues have some different ideas about some of the things I'm saying. Another thing that is important, I think, is that, and that's related to the previous, is that the reader should never think, at least not in the end, after reading the entire thesis, what did you mean? And this goes for concept you use, this goes for paragraphs you write, and obviously for the entire thesis. You know what you meant, your tutors probably know what you meant, but it might not be written down in your thesis. So make sure you explain everything for this uninformed reader. So the reader should never end up with this question, I've written the entire thesis, but I don't know what the author meant by, well, X. I already touched upon quotations and references, so you should not plagiarize. So if you have an actual quote, put it between quotation marks, provide a reference, And be consistent in this. So if you use double quotation marks for one quote, then you use them also for the next. And what you should do is use some style of quoting and referring. APA is a very general used style of quoting and referring. Some students, some supervisors don't like APA. They prefer Chicago style, for instance. So make sure that you discuss this with your supervisor and pick one of those styles. So APA basically is the default according to many of our colleagues, but some say no, Chicago is the default. Well, it's not really important which one you choose. You should at least be consistent. So if you use a quotation and you use APA in chapter 1, then also use APA in chapter 2 and don't change to Chicago. So make sure it is consistent and that it is according to one type of style. Discuss this with your supervisor. And this is important because if those quotations and references are not according to one style, then this is a reason not to grade the thesis. So a tip here is if you hand in a chapter, or chapter 1, also hand in the preliminary reference list, so your supervisor can take a look at it and say, whoa, this is incorrect, or you're making this mistake. So it can go wrong in so many ways. So just putting one, what you could do, for instance, is if you have chosen APA and you have made your reference list, just check at some moment whether you have put a point after after each of your references. If you have put a space between the initials of the names, the first names of an author, stuff like that. Just check that for every reference, and then check the next thing for every reference. Is the year of publication in the same place, in the same location in the reference for all your references? So don't do anything else. Just check all the years. Just check all the points. Just check all the spaces and stuff like that. Do this one by one, and then you'll probably notice that you made some mistakes. Also, you could use in your writing program like Word, you could use the software that will generate the reference list for you, but then you still need to check all this, because it doesn't work always quite as well. And if you put some mistake into the database your system uses, then this mistake will end up in your reference list. So don't assume that by using Word to make your reference list, for instance, it will be flawless. You still need to check it because, well, maybe you have made a mistake, and Word might also not do it according to the latest version, because APA, for instance, changed 2 years ago. So look at that. So the most important thing is to be consistent. Okay, so another thing with explaining and also with quoting using references, don't use non-academic sources for academic jargon, for academic concepts, for philosophical ideas. So if you want to give a brief definition and you don't want to give it yourself, but you want it to be You want to make sure that someone actually gave that definition, that you're right. Don't use a general dictionary, because then you make someone that makes an English dictionary or a Dutch dictionary, you turn them into academic philosophers, and they aren't. So don't use general dictionaries. Also, don't use Wikipedia. When it comes down to philosophy, there are a lot of mistakes on Wikipedia pages. Also, don't say someone said, stuff like that. Use academic resources. Now, obviously, you could use an academic encyclopedia, but then you have to take into account the following. Say, for instance, that you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The writers of these longer pieces, those lemmas, might have a quite idiosyncratic view on a topic. I've seen that in essays of my students that write about philosophy of mind. If they cite from this encyclopedia, then I usually think, but that's not what the behaviorists had, or that's not what identity theorist means. So they have sometimes philosophers writing these lemmas that basically write what they think the behaviorist should have said, or what they think the identity theorist should have said. And you usually find something in the introduction that say, well, this is how I see it, and then it's not really. I think it's really misleading to call this an encyclopedia, but you can use it. But make sure that you read the entire lemma, and that sometimes means that you should use another source. But best, of course, is using general introductions if you want general philosophical concepts to find a definition of something like that. Discuss these things with your supervisor, of course, because we're now already talking about secondary literature. So the primary literature, of course, well, if you want to write about Plato, then you have a choice of different editions, but basically you have the original text or a translation of it. So you could use a different translation, maybe, if your supervisor says, well, this translation is not that good. So I think, for instance, the Dutch translation of Hume's treatise is really bad. So I would like you to use the original English, an edition in the original English, for instance. And secondary literature, also discuss this with your supervisor. They know what the right secondary literature is. Okay, well, we can't expect your, it would be nice, of course, but we can't expect your thesis to be flawless. So usually there are some mistakes in the reference list. There are some typos in the text itself. There probably are some typos in this PowerPoint. So the problem usually is it's easy to miss them in your own text, because you know what you've written, especially if you have written it just prior to submitting the chapter. So if you have 2 months and wait and then read your text again, then you'll find a lot of your own typos if they are there. But you don't have that time. So everybody makes mistakes. Read your text prior to submitting it. Just read it once again, just for typos. Not to change anything of the content, but just to find typos, or maybe things that are wrong in grammar. Just check for that.
That's it for today. Stay safe.